Alright, this is FYNDR, and as promised, this is the 10th anniversary video for the channel. So first of all, I wanted to thank all the viewers and subscribers for sticking with me the past decade. I know I've been updating things pretty sporadically, especially over the past few years, but I've seen that when I put out a new video, there are still those of you that view them and make comments. So I appreciate that a lot. And I hope that you all enjoy the videos that I put out when I do put out videos. So originally for this video, I was going to play the first part of I Want to Be the Guy as sort of a bookend to the very first video that I did. I think in that video I had played through the fight with Mike Tyson and got to the save point after that. So I was going to play through that, but there were a couple issues. One of which is that I was mostly meaning this video to be an introspective for the channel, or a retrospective rather, and sort of discuss how things were at the time that I first created the channel and how things are now. But the problem is it's hard to do that when you're trying to play I Want to Be the Guy, especially this game, just because it's so difficult. And the other thing too is that there seems to be an issue running this on my current system, and so it's kind of difficult to troubleshoot that while filming and playing to that point. So instead, I think I'm just going to switch back and forth between the title screen and the title, or the prologue cinematic, and that way it's a little dynamic and you have something to look at while the video goes. But for the most part, this is just going to be sort of a retrospective, like I said, and a channel update kind of video. So to start with, I guess we can go with when the channel was first created. Started with the actual game I Want to Be the Guy, and when I first played that, which would have been around December 2007, January 2008, around that time frame. I had actually played it a little bit when Cain, he's the creator that made the game, had a beta version that was out on his site. I had just started my freshman year. It was near the end of that semester, and I managed to find it just looking up old indie, or not old indie games, but like old emulated games and also current 2D indie games, of which this is one. And so I stumbled upon it and ended up playing the beta, which I think covered a good deal of the game up till I think the Castle of the Guys. That hadn't been completed at the time that I first played it. So I was part of the early forum community there and provided feedback and discussed the game and things like that. And followed it around until Cain finished the game and put out the final release for it. But then I played and beat that, and that went fine. And then once I got back from break, I decided to do a video walkthrough just for the fun of it. I think there'd been some discussion on the forum along those lines. But also it was around that time that YouTubers started becoming fairly popular, or at least enough of a thing that there were more than a couple of them. And so I thought maybe it'd be a good chance to sort of flex that muscle and see what happens. So I went ahead and created the video walkthrough for I Want to Be the Guy, and actually I think those videos are probably the most popular on my channel, historically at least, because I think part 1 is like over 100,000 views. The other parts are all high tens of thousands of views, which is fine. I mean, it fulfilled a role at the time just because the game suddenly became popular and my video walkthrough was around. It coincided with that time frame, so that worked out decently, and I sort of used it to launch the channel in the sense that I was able to pick up subscribers and other viewers from it. But yeah, in general, otherwise I've done other walkthroughs, mostly for computer games, and those have gone fine. But for the most part, it's sort of a side project that I do every once in a while, which I guess also accounts for the fact that my updates are so sporadic. just because I'm usually working on other things. And um, I think usually I put out at least a video a year. I don't think there's been any huge gaps. I mean, there are large gaps, but not larger than a year for sure. But in any case, so I do have other things that I work on, and especially in the last 10 years, I've done a few things. Um, I guess to start with, around the time that I finished I Want to Be the Guy and did the video walkthroughs, I started work on a game of my own that was similar in the sense that a, I guess you could say it's a masochistic platformer. Um, and that game was The Last Pikeman, which I did a video walkthrough of several years back. Um, but yeah, I worked on that from around 2008 to I think 2011. Um, Most of that is because I was going through my undergrad at the time, going through computer science, uh, and it was around the time that I finished the degree that I finished that game and released it. Mostly within the game maker community. Yo-Yo Games was the site that hosted it originally. It's no longer there because I think it changed hands a couple times, the domain. But I have all the games that I've completed since then on my personal site, which I think is in the channel description, but I'll link it below too. But yeah, I mostly worked on that during that time. Um, and then, and in terms of other game development projects, um, after I did my undergrad, I went to graduate school, again for computer science. And most of that time I was spent working on the program just because it's so involved. But near the end of that, when I had more time available, me and a couple of friends of mine that were also programmers formed a small mobile development group called Spiel Mobile Software, and we made a couple, like a handful of apps for Android. Pretty basic ones, to be honest, but they're sort of interesting, and it was sort of a different avenue to sort of explore in terms of game development. But at the same time I was working on that, I started work on Onero, which was a 3D game that I had envisioned in late 2012. So, yeah, I worked on that, and I believe I completed that. It would have been probably a year later, 2013. But the problem was I don't have any sort of 3D modeling experience or artistic skill along those lines. So what I had to do was um, put in sort of placeholder programmer art for a lot of things. And then I set to work to find other people that had that sort of experience, or other students that were at the university in the town that I was in at the time, to see if I could really recruit some talent there. And we worked a little bit on revamping Onero so that it was a little more palatable, but like in terms of graphics and just overall making it like the version that I had made, and which eventually became the finished version, was essentially the prototype. And so we were trying to make a new game based off of that as a reference. But that project fell through over the course of that year. So over the summer of 2014, I think it was, that was when I went through and tried cleaning things up as I could and streamlining a few things. And then I released that on, I think, well, it has its own website and then also my personal site, which I set up. But yeah, so right now it's sort of just a permanent prototype is how I term it, but it's just its own thing. And actually, not necessarily recently, but since it was released, it's had sort of a niche following in the sense that there are people on itch.io and other gaming sites that are into surreal, rough 3D games, and so in that sense, it's gotten some traction there, which is nice. So, yeah. Other than that, I worked on a game called Terrier, which I made in 2015. And a lot of the reason for making that game was just because Onero was so convoluted and too large in scope to have been completed by one person. So I wanted to put out a game that was relatively simple in its mechanics, but really well developed. And I think I succeeded pretty well in that regard. And I think I finished that summer of 2015. So actually, since then, I've branched into some other projects that are not game development related. A lot of 2015 I spent working on writing. Well, actually, it would have been mostly 2016, I think, because I started writing something for National Novel Writers Month in November 2015. And I had a story that I was writing called Maniac, which the premise is that it takes place in the 1980s, and there's a group of psychics, and they all have different powers that aren't necessarily psychic per se, but that's just the term that's used in universe. And they're fighting against another group that are trying to trigger a nuclear war, essentially. So I started writing it in November. I hit 50,000 words, which was the goal for NaNoWriMo. And from there, I ended up writing another 50,000. So it became a full-fledged novel at that point. But there were some issues with it after that. Namely that it was quite long. I think it was like 115,000 words, which for a first novel in particular is pretty long. And the other thing is it was kind of hard to find editors for it because I needed to have someone go through and read through it. And so a lot of 2016 was spent basically trying to find people for that, and I had some family members look through it. A lot of them didn't have very useful criticism, but one of them did have a pretty complete set of notes, so I used that to edit it. And then I spent most of the end of 2016 and 2017 trying to get Maniac published, which is a fairly involved process for anyone that's sort of out of the know. Usually, you don't contact a publisher directly. You work through intermediaries, which are called literary agents. So you would contact a literary agency and you'd have basically a cover letter and a synopsis that sort of sells the story. And then if they agree to represent you, they give you some information on things to edit. You go through and extensively revise the document, or the manuscript rather. And then you go from there to find a publisher. So the very first step is just writing out these materials and trying to submit them. And the process is pretty long because usually it takes around a month to hear back from an agency, regardless of whether or not they say they accept or not. And also the number of rejections that you're expected to face is relatively large. I think the average is something like 80 to 100 rejections before you get someone that is interested, basically. So I went through a pretty long process of submitting batches of 10, basically, query letters, or what they're called. So you query the agencies for representation. And just sort of revising the materials in different ways and tweaking things to try to see how things would go. But basically, over the course of that time, I didn't get any takers. And then in fall of 2017, I had two of my friends read through it and provide criticism. And their feedback was very extensive, but to the point where it would require basically a major rewrite of what I had written. So what I ended up doing was putting that on ice for the foreseeable future and working on other writing projects. So actually for this NaNoWriMo, I did a short story, which I tried to take the things that I learned from writing Maniac and applying them to the story that I wrote, and it seems to have come out pretty well compared to that. And my friends read through it and they really liked it, and it seems like it's something that I might potentially be able to get published, but we'll see. In any case, so that took up a lot of my time from basically 2015 to the present was mostly writing things. Although the other thing was in 2017, like a lot of that time was spent, like I was working on writing for Maniac, but it was mostly tweaking things once a month and then submitting them for approval. So there were large swaths of time that I had devoted to. I didn't have anything really going on, so what I ended up doing was I was thinking of the possibility of reworking Maniac, if all else failed, into a game concept. Probably something like an adventure game or like a visual novel kind of setup. And as part of that, I wanted to use some music, like just 80s music basically, because it takes place in the 80s. I had certain ideas for themes and looping instrumentals for well-known songs and things like that. So I did some sound editing to start with, and then I stumbled on the vaporwave scene, which was really interesting. And so what I ended up doing was experimenting with the sound creation process and remixing audio, and I ended up putting out an album, which I released on YouTube, Terminal Amusement. And then that went pretty well, so I went ahead and did a couple other albums and then some compilations. So 2017 was pretty much the year that I made Vaporwave, essentially. And also some writing, but mostly it was the Vaporwave albums. That's probably the greatest creative outlet that I had at the time. So yeah, so in terms of game development, there was The Last Pikeman, which was from around 2008 to 2011. Then 2012 to 2013, it was Spiel Mobile Software related stuff. Then 2014 was Onero, and 2015 was Terrier. And then basically I haven't really done any game development stuff since then. So there was a gap in 2016 and 2017 just from writing projects, music projects, that sort of thing. But this year I tried to make a point of it to work on a game development project, like a fresh one, which I'm in the process of doing. I'm making a platforming game. I don't want to make it like The Last Pikeman in the sense of it being overly difficult. Just like basically a standard kind of game. And hopefully, I've got some ideas for it, and hopefully it'll turn out well, but I've managed to get a fair amount of it done, like the groundwork for setting up options and controls and physics. Most of that is done. So I think I'm planning on having a demo available end of March probably, and then by the end of the year I should have it completed. And at the same time as that's going, I'm trying to move forward with publishing this short story. But yeah, that's probably what I'm going to be doing creatively in 2018. So yeah, I don't know to what extent any of the viewers or subscribers are aware of the other projects that I do or have consumed them or enjoyed them. Hopefully some. But basically, this is what I do in between videos, and the videos themselves serve a sort of purpose and hopefully help people, especially like the walkthroughs, or entertain people when it's a Let's Play. But yeah, I guess in terms of videos going forward, I want to say that I'll probably not be creating any new videos until such time as I'm able to um, come up with a subject, first of all, that's decent, and then second of all, get some better recording equipment um, and editing software and get to know about it, just so that I can make the videos a little more punchy and less of a monologue. I say that in a video that is itself pretty much a monologue, but yeah. So I'm not entirely sure when the next video will be up. I might put out something promotional for um well, I'm not sure. Maybe for the demo of the game I'm making, I might just distribute that internally um, with some people that I normally have playtest. Um, and then I'll just create a walkthrough perhaps for the completed game once that's out later this year. Um, but if nothing else, I'll have another video out by the end of the year, just sort of as a status update. So yeah, yeah, thanks for watching, and I hope that this video was somewhat informative, shed a little light into my life and what I do, um, and just sort of the creative stuff that I've been involved in, apart from videos, um, and a very, very vague sense of the videos that are coming down the pipeline. Um, so I guess just to underscore, even though I do put out videos only very occasionally, I plan to keep the channel around for in perpetuity, basically. So keeping the old videos around and putting out new content as I can. So yeah, here's to another 10 years, I guess. And I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. So stay tuned.